At 80, she lost her home, then inherited one everyone called worthless, except her dog. The eviction notice came in red ink, folded stiff in Evelyn Mercer's trembling hands. Within weeks, she was driving through the Appalachian hills toward a decaying house she barely remembered, told it wasn't worth saving. But the moment she stepped inside, her aging German shepherd ran upstairs and refused to leave a single locked door, waiting as if something behind it still mattered. If you found yourself in her place, would you walk away or open that door? Tell me what you'd do. The envelope was thicker than the usual mail. Evelyn Mercer noticed that first. It lay on the narrow table by her apartment door, its corner catching against the peeling wallpaper, as though it had been shoved through with unnecessary force. And outside, the hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner, the same scent that had clung to the third floor of the building since she moved in 27 years ago. Atlas patted over, nails clicking softly on the worn linoleum. At 9 years old, the German shepherd no longer rushed toward sounds the way he once had. He simply stood beside her, waiting, watchful. Evelyn bent slowly, joints stiff from the morning chill, and picked up the envelope. The logo printed in sharp blue letters across the corner did not belong to her landlord. It belonged to a redevelopment firm. She slid it open with the small silver letter opener she had owned since 1972. The words inside were neat, clinical, impersonal. Notice of termination of tenancy. The building had been sold. Renovations would begin immediately, and all current tenants were to vacate within 30 days. 30 days? Evelyn read it twice, then a third time, as though a hidden sentence might appear if she was patient enough. Atlas nudged her hand gently. "I'm still here," she murmured to him, though she wasn't sure who she was reassuring. The radiator clanged to life behind her, coughing heat into the narrow room. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a galley kitchen, a living room just wide enough for a couch, and her late husband's recliner. She had downsized here after Richard passed, telling herself she didn't need much. It had been safe, predictable, paid for on time, every month. Now the walls felt thinner. By afternoon, half the building buzzed with rumors. The younger tenants spoke of rising property values and boutique coffee shops, thus the older ones stood quietly in the hallway, clutching similar envelopes. Evelyn called Mark first. Her son answered on the fourth ring. "Mom? They're selling the building," she said evenly. "I have 30 days. There was a pause. Not shock. Calculation. "Well," Mark exhaled, "maybe this is a blessing in disguise. We've talked about assisted living before. You'd have meals, transportation, activities. It would be easier?" Easier. She glanced at the bookshelf she'd assembled herself 15 years ago. The framed photo of Richard in his fishing vest. The small brass lamp she'd repaired instead of replacing. "I'm not ready for that," she said. "Mom, you're 80. "I'm aware." Another pause. Softer this time. "Oh, you can't keep living alone forever." She thanked him for his concern and ended the call before the silence turned into instruction. Claire called that evening after Mark texted her. "Oh, Mom, that's terrible," Claire said, her voice warm but distant, like a radio station slightly out of range. "If you need help packing, I can try to come down for a weekend. Things are busy here, though." "I'll manage," Evelyn replied. Claire hesitated. "Maybe this is an opportunity. A fresh start?" At 80, Evelyn smiled politely into the phone, though no one could see it. "Yes, perhaps." After she hung up, she stood in the center of her living room. Atlas leaned his weight against her leg. She had worked for 35 years in the records department at Mercy General Hospital, though she had balanced accounts when she ran her small bookkeeping business out of their dining room in the 70s. She had learned tax codes and payroll software before most of her colleagues could operate a fax machine. She had not been incompetent. She had not been fragile. But standing there with the eviction notice folded in her hand, she felt something close to invisibility. As if the world had quietly agreed she was done. 3 days later, another call came. This one from a lawyer's office she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Mercer?" This is Daniel Rourke, estate attorney. I'm contacting you regarding the passing of Mr. Harold Finch. The name stirred faintly. A cousin on her mother's side. Quiet man. Rare visits. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. Yes, Mr. Finch named you sole beneficiary of his property in Clay County, West Virginia. Evelyn blinked. Property? A residential structure. I should be transparent, Mrs. Mercer. The house is in significant disrepair. It has no market viability in its current condition. Structurally, worthless would not be an unfair description. Worthless. The word hung between them. You are not obligated to accept, the lawyer continued. But if you do, you assume full responsibility. Evelyn looked around her apartment. The thin walls, the faded carpet, the stack of boxes she would soon need. How soon could I see it? She asked. There was a rustle of papers. Keys can be arranged within the week. That night, she spread the eviction notice and the estate paperwork side by side on her kitchen table. Atlas rested his head on her slippered foot. 30 days. A house no one wanted. Now she ran her finger along the lawyer's letterhead again. Worthless. Evelyn folded the papers carefully, aligning the edges as she always had with important documents. Her hands were steady now. Well, she said quietly to Atlas, if no one else sees any value in it, I suppose we'll have to look for ourselves. Atlas lifted his head, ears tilting forward. Within a week, the apartment was half-packed. Boxes labeled in neat handwriting lined the hallway. The building manager avoided eye contact when she returned her mailbox key. On her last morning there, Evelyn stood by the window and watched a construction surveyor measuring the sidewalk below. The future had already arrived. It simply hadn't waited for her permission. She locked the door behind her. Atlas followed closely as she walked down the narrow staircase for the final time, when West Virginia was a 4-hour drive south. She did not know what waited there, only that she would see it herself, and that she would not be moved like furniture without first opening the door. The highway narrowed as Evelyn drove south, the city thinning into hills and stretches of forest that felt older than memory. Atlas sat upright in the back seat, alert but quiet, his reflection occasionally flickering in the side window, like a second, shadowed traveler. By the time she crossed into West Virginia, the sky had shifted into a pale gray sheet. The GPS lost signal twice before guiding her onto a 2-lane road that twisted upward through dense trees. The pavement grew uneven, patched in places, cracked in others. A hand-painted sign reading Clay County, Estin, 1858, leaned crookedly at the roadside. This must be it, she murmured. The final turn led to a gravel drive half swallowed by weeds. Evelyn slowed the car and let it roll forward. The house revealed itself slowly through the trees. It stood on a rise overlooking a shallow valley, weathered and pale, its paint long surrendered to the sun. The porch sagged slightly at the center, as if bowing under years of quiet strain. Several windows were cracked. One upstairs pane had been boarded with mismatched wood. The roofline dipped subtly on the right side. She turned off the engine. For a moment, neither she nor Atlas moved. The silence felt different from Pittsburgh's. No distant sirens, no elevator cables humming, only wind sliding through the trees and the faint creak of aging wood. Well, she said softly, you're not pretty. Atlas pushed forward the moment she opened the door. He jumped down stiffly, but with determination, nose already lifting to test the unfamiliar air. Evelyn stepped out more cautiously. Gravel shifted beneath her shoes. The house seemed larger up close than it had from the road, though not in a comforting way. It loomed, slightly crooked, as though uncertain whether to welcome her or warn her off. The front steps groaned under her weight. She gripped the railing, noticing splinters along the underside. The front door key, provided by the attorney's office, turned with resistance before finally giving way. The door opened inward with a long, brittle sigh. Dust drifted in pale beams of light slicing through the front windows. The air inside carried the scent of old paper and damp wood. Neglect, but not decay. Atlas stepped in first. His nails echoed sharply on the hardwood floor. He paused in the center of the room, head turning slowly from side to side. Then, without hesitation, he trotted toward the staircase at the back of the house. Atlas, she called, but he didn't slow. He climbed halfway up before she could reach the first step. The staircase curved narrowly along the wall, its banister dark with age. Atlas moved with surprising speed for his years, paws deliberate, steady. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched long and thin, lit by a single grimy window at the far end. He walked directly to the last door on the left, and stopped. Evelyn reached the base of the stairs and looked up. "What is it?" Atlas sat. The door was different from the others. While the paint had chipped and faded across the rest of the house, this one appeared more intact. The brass knob gleamed faintly beneath dust. A small lock had been fastened beneath it. Old, but not rusted. "Probably mice," she muttered, though something about the lock felt deliberate. Atlas lowered himself slowly to the floor, nose inches from the seam of the door. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply stayed there. Evelyn let out a long breath and began exploring the first floor instead. The living room held faded floral wallpaper and a stone fireplace blackened by years of use. The kitchen cabinets sagged slightly on their hinges, but were intact. A heavy wooden table stood near the back window, coated in dust but solid beneath her touch, structurally worthless. She ran her hand across the wall beside the staircase. The wood felt dry but firm. The floorboards beneath her shoes did not shift. Outside, just a truck engine rumbled faintly. Evelyn stepped back onto the porch to see a dusty blue pickup idling at the edge of the driveway. A man in his late 50s climbed out, broad-shouldered, oil-stained jeans, wary eyes. "You must be the new owner?" he called. "I suppose I am." He approached cautiously, removing his cap. "Silas Boone. I live down the road. Been keeping an eye on the place. Evelyn Mercer." He glanced at the porch supports, then at the roof line. "Winters get rough up here. Snow will settle heavy. That roof sags more each year. I've noticed. You planning to fix it?" "I'm planning to stay," she replied. He studied her for a long second, as if recalculating something. "Well, if you need tools or a hand, I've got a shop down the hill." "Thank you." Silas nodded once and headed back to his truck, leaving a faint trail of dust behind him as he drove away. Inside, Atlas had not moved. He still lay in the hallway outside the locked door. Evelyn climbed the stairs slowly this time, testing each step before committing her weight. The wood groaned, but held. She reached the top and walked toward him. "What do you think you found?" she asked. Atlas's ears twitched, but he did not look away from the door. Evelyn tried the knob. It did not turn. The lock felt firm, maintained, not abandoned. She leaned closer and pressed her ear lightly against the wood. Silence. No scratching. No rustling. Just stillness. "You can't stay up here all day," she told him gently. Atlas rose reluctantly and followed her downstairs when she descended, but his head turned back toward the hallway until it disappeared from view. By evening, Evelyn had cleared a corner of the living room for a temporary sleeping space. She unrolled blankets and unpacked 2 lamps. The electricity flickered once but held steady. Atlas lay near the foot of the staircase. Not beside her, not near the door. Near the stairs. Watching. As night fell fully over the hills, the house settled into its sounds. Timbers adjusting, wind threading through loose shingles. Evelyn lay awake longer than she intended, staring at the ceiling where faint cracks traced delicate lines above her. Worthless. The word echoed differently here. Above her, the locked door waited in the dark, and Atlas did not once look away from it. Morning arrived slowly over the hills, pale light filtering through the thin curtains Evelyn had shaken free of dust the night before. And the house felt colder at dawn than it had in the evening, as though it had exhaled warmth into the dark and forgotten to pull it back in. Evelyn rose carefully from the makeshift bed she'd arranged near the fireplace. Her back protested the hardwood floor, but she ignored it. Atlas was no longer at the base of the stairs. She knew where he would be. When she climbed halfway up, she could see him stretched across the narrow hallway boards, directly in front of the locked door. His body lay parallel to it, head resting on his paws, ears alert though his eyes were closed. "Atlas?" she called softly. One eye opened. He thumped his tail once, then returned his gaze to the door. "You're not guarding Fort Knox," she muttered. She approached the door again, studying it more carefully in the daylight. The paint had chipped at the edges, but revealing older layers beneath, cream over pale green over bare wood. The lock was modest but purposeful, not decorative, installed with intention. Evelyn pressed her palm against the surface. It felt cool and solid. She tried the knob again. It didn't budge. "You can't stay here all day," she told Atlas. "We have work to do." She descended to the kitchen and began unpacking the essentials. Coffee tin, small kettle, 2 chipped mugs she'd wrapped in towels. The cabinets creaked, but held her dishes without complaint. She found the breaker panel and flipped each switch cautiously. Electricity hummed through the wires like a tentative promise. Atlas did not follow her. When she carried a bowl of water upstairs, he drank without leaving his post. "Is there a squirrel behind there?" she asked, crouching beside him. "Or have you decided this is your new job?" He sniffed at the base of the door seam, slow and deliberate. Not frantic, not aggressive. It unsettled her more than barking would have. By midday, she had cleared enough space downstairs to feel temporarily settled. She dragged a small dresser into the corner of the bedroom and swept layers of dust from the floor. The house was weary, but not hollow. It held itself upright. Still, every time she looked toward the staircase, she felt that narrow hallway pressing into her thoughts. In the afternoon, she tried coaxing Atlas with treats. He accepted them politely, but carried each piece back upstairs, chewing in front of the locked door as though maintaining his station. "You're being ridiculous," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. By evening, as a thin fog rolled across the valley below, the hills faded into muted shapes and the sky dimmed earlier than she expected. She lit 2 lamps downstairs and cooked a simple meal of soup heated on the stovetop. Atlas remained upstairs. Evelyn carried her bowl to the base of the stairs and called again. "Come eat!" After a long moment, he descended halfway, looked at her, then turned and went back up. Something about the steadiness of his refusal pressed against her ribs. Atlas had once worked search and rescue before she adopted him. She remembered the volunteer coordinator telling her how he would lock onto a scent and refuse to abandon it. Focused to a fault. Now he lay inches from that door, as if waiting for someone to open it. Night settled fully, bringing a sharper wind that rattled the loose pane in the upstairs hallway window. The sound echoed faintly down the staircase. Evelyn climbed again, flashlight in hand this time. The beam cut a narrow path through the dark. Atlas shifted slightly as she approached but did not leave his position. She knelt beside him. "Listen," she whispered, almost embarrassed by the softness of her voice. "There's nothing back there for you." The wind pushed harder against the house, and somewhere in the walls a board creaked. Atlas raised his head, not toward the window, toward the door. His ears stood fully upright now. His breathing slowed, focused. Evelyn held her own breath and leaned closer to the wood. Nothing. No scratching. No movement. No whisper of rodents or trapped air. Only stillness. She tapped lightly against the panel, while the sound echoed dull and contained, as though the room beyond were tightly sealed. "Harold," she murmured without meaning to, recalling the cousin she barely knew. Why lock a room in a house already forgotten? Atlas let out a low, almost inaudible huff. Not a growl, not a bark. A signal. The wind outside intensified briefly, rattling the loose pane again. The hallway felt narrower in the flashlight beam, shadows lengthening unevenly along the walls. Evelyn straightened slowly. "All right," she said to the dog. "We'll look into it. But not tonight." She reached for his collar gently. For a moment he resisted, just enough for her to feel it. Then he stood and followed her down the stairs, though his head turned back until the hallway vanished from view. Later, when she lay beneath her blanket, she listened to the house breathe. The wind softened after midnight. The silence that followed felt deeper than before. Atlas did not settle at the base of the stairs this time. He returned upstairs. Evelyn heard the soft thud of his body lying down again in front of the locked door. She stared at the ceiling, the faint beam of moonlight tracing across it. The house might have been dismissed as worthless, but something inside it had captured the full attention of a dog trained never to ignore what mattered. And for the first time since she arrived, Evelyn felt a thread of unease tighten beneath her steady exterior. She turned onto her side, listening to the faint rhythm of Atlas's breathing above her. He did not move. He did not sleep deeply. He waited. The first frost came 2 mornings later. Evelyn felt it before she saw it. The sharpness in the air when she stepped from beneath her blanket. The brittle stillness pressing against the windows. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and shuffled toward the kitchen. The faucet sputtered when she turned it on. Then it stopped. She stared at it a moment, hand still gripping the handle. "No," she whispered. She tried again. A hollow cough answered her, then silence. Outside, the hills were glazed in white. The grass that had looked soft and neglected now shimmered with icy precision. The sagging porch rail wore a delicate crust of frost, like lace over decay. Atlas descended from upstairs quietly, though his glance drifted toward the staircase before settling on her. "It's fine," she told him. "Just cold." She knew better. By mid-morning, she had wrapped towels around the exposed pipes under the sink and opened cabinet doors to circulate what little warmth the house could hold. The furnace had kicked on twice during the night, but now it responded sluggishly, producing air that was barely lukewarm. The house creaked differently in the cold. Boards contracted, nails complained. Wind threaded itself through unseen seams and whispered along the hallway upstairs. Atlas returned to the locked door. She followed him this time, climbing carefully, one hand gripping the railing. The hallway felt narrower in daylight. The pale window at its end rimmed with frost. "Nothing has changed," she said, more to herself than to him. He stood instead of lying down, nose hovering inches from the door seam. His tail did not wag. Evelyn pressed her ear against the wood again. Silence. Yet Atlas's posture remained alert, every muscle tuned toward whatever lay beyond. A gust of wind struck the side of the house without warning, rattling the loose pane in the hallway window. The sudden crack of it made her flinch. Atlas barked. It was sharp and startling, echoing down the staircase. "Atlas!" He barked again, stepping forward, paws scraping lightly against the wood near the base of the door. The sound unsettled her more than the cold pipes downstairs. "What do you think is in there?" she asked, her voice thin in the narrow corridor. The wind howled again, louder this time. Somewhere in the attic space, something shifted with a low thud. The house was speaking in a language she did not yet understand. Fear moved quietly into her chest. Not panic, not hysteria, just a steady tightening. Now she had refused assisted living. She had chosen this place. And now she stood in a hallway in rural West Virginia, listening to winter test the bones of a house deemed worthless. She stepped back from the door. "We'll deal with it later," she said, though she wasn't certain what she meant. Downstairs, she found her phone and called Mark. He answered on the second ring this time. "How's the mansion?" "It's cold," she said evenly. "The pipes froze." A sigh on the other end. "Mom, I told you this wasn't practical. You can't handle property maintenance at 80. "I'm handling it." "Barely. You should sell it before it becomes a money pit. There are buyers who'd take land like that without hesitation." She looked toward the staircase again. "I just got here," she replied. "Oh, you don't have to prove anything." The comment struck deeper than he intended. After the call ended, she stood still in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter. She had once managed quarterly tax audits without blinking. She had negotiated hospital supply contracts. She had balanced payroll when her bookkeeping clients panicked over new regulations. She was not helpless, just displaced. Atlas padded back down the stairs and sat beside her, pressing his shoulder lightly against her calf. The furnace clicked off completely. She moved toward the breaker panel and reset it. The system groaned, then resumed a faint hum. By late afternoon, the frost outside had begun to melt, dripping slowly from the porch rail. The pipes loosened just enough to release a thin stream of water from the faucet. Temporary relief. Once as dusk approached, the temperature dropped again. Evelyn carried a small space heater into the bedroom and positioned it carefully. She layered 2 extra blankets over the mattress and stacked firewood beside the hearth downstairs, though she had not yet tested the chimney. Atlas climbed the stairs before she did. When she reached the hallway, she found him not lying down this time, but standing rigidly in front of the locked door. The wind rose sharply, striking the side of the house with force. The hallway window rattled violently. And then, a sound. Not from the wind. From behind the door. A faint, dull vibration. Like something shifting against wood. Evelyn froze. Atlas barked once, deep and commanding. "Stop," she whispered. Yet though she did not know whether she was speaking to him or to whatever noise had carried through the door, she stepped forward slowly and placed her palm flat against the surface. Cold, solid. The vibration did not repeat. Perhaps it had been the wind compressing air behind the walls, perhaps old boards settling under temperature change. But Atlas did not relax. His breathing remained controlled but intense. "Enough," she said firmly, taking his collar and guiding him back. He resisted for a second, just enough to feel it, before yielding. They descended together. That night, Evelyn built her first small fire in the hearth. Flames flickered against the stone, casting long, uneven shadows across the living room walls. The warmth felt immediate and alive in a way the furnace did not. Atlas lay near the stairs again. Not asleep, no, not restless. Watching. Evelyn sat in the worn armchair she had dragged near the fireplace and stared at the flames. The wind outside continued its steady assault against the hills. She had chosen this. Chosen the unknown over quiet confinement. Chosen uncertainty over being told where to sit, when to eat, when to sleep. Yet as the fire crackled and the house whispered around her, doubt pressed harder than it had the day she opened the eviction notice. Upstairs, beyond the locked door, something waited in stillness. And Atlas, who had once searched for survivors beneath collapsed buildings, refused to dismiss it as nothing. The frost thickened again on the windows. Winter had arrived, and the house had begun to answer back. The leak appeared the next morning. Evelyn noticed it while pouring coffee, as a faint drip echoed from above, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Not the erratic tap of melting frost, something heavier. She set the mug down and listened. Drip, drip. She followed the sound to the base of the staircase. A dark stain had begun to spread along the ceiling, just beneath the upstairs hallway. A small bead of water swelled at its center before falling to the hardwood floor. "Of course," she murmured. Atlas was already halfway up the stairs. "Wait," she called, but he did not. The wood beneath her hand felt colder than it had the day before. She gripped the banister and began climbing carefully, testing each step. The boards groaned in complaint, but they held. Halfway up, she paused to catch her breath. The smell of damp wood hung faintly in the air. At the top, Atlas stood near the locked door, ears alert, and a thin draft slipped beneath it, carrying the scent of chilled air. The stain on the ceiling extended along the hallway edge. She stepped forward to inspect it, leaning slightly toward the wall. The board beneath her left foot shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. Her heel slid backward. The world tilted. Her grip on the banister failed for a fraction of a second, fingers scraping against the worn wood. The hallway ceiling blurred above her. The staircase behind her waited without mercy. Atlas moved before she could think. His body pressed firmly against her legs, bracing, anchoring. She felt the solid weight of him beneath her hip and shoulder as she lost balance. They fell together, but not down the stairs. She landed hard against the hallway floor, Atlas partially beneath her, absorbing the impact. And the breath rushed from her lungs. Pain flared along her side. For a moment, there was only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Atlas," she whispered hoarsely. He shifted beneath her, then wriggled free carefully, standing over her with urgent concern in his eyes. He nudged her cheek once, then twice. "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook. She stayed where she was, staring up at the ceiling. If she had fallen backward, she would have tumbled down the full staircase. There would have been no one here to call for help. The thought pressed heavily against her chest. Slowly, she pushed herself upright, wincing as her ribs protested. Atlas stayed close, pressing against her side as she sat. "I'm fine," she repeated, this time more firmly. Her gaze drifted toward the banister where her hand had slipped, but something about it looked different from before. She crawled toward it, inspecting the rail more closely. The wood near the middle post appeared slightly separated from the wall, as though loosened intentionally rather than by decay. She reached out and tugged gently. The banister shifted, not crumbling, shifting. Her pulse steadied into focus. With careful pressure, she pried the section slightly away from the wall. The wood had been reattached at some point, but not permanently. Behind the rail, nestled within a narrow cavity between studs, something caught the light. Wax paper. Her fingers trembled as she reached inside. The paper crinkled softly against her skin. It had been folded tightly, sealed against moisture. She eased it free and unfolded it slowly. Inside lay a small brass key. Simple, polished once, though dulled now by time. Her breath caught. She examined the wax paper again. A date was written faintly along the edge in blue ink. 8 years ago. Not decades. Not forgotten history. Recent. Atlas watched her intently, head slightly tilted. She looked toward the locked door. The hallway seemed to narrow around it. "Harold?" she murmured under her breath. "What were you protecting?" The drip from the ceiling continued, though softer now. She stood carefully, testing her balance. Her hip ached, but held steady. Atlas remained pressed against her leg, as though refusing to allow a second misstep. Evelyn approached the locked door slowly. The brass knob gleamed faintly in the dim winter light. The small lock beneath it waited quietly. She held the key in her palm. It felt heavier than it should. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if this was nothing more than a forgotten storage room? What if she had nearly broken her neck, chasing rodents and imagination? But Atlas stepped forward again, positioning himself directly beside the door, waiting. She knelt slowly and examined the lock more closely. The metal showed minimal corrosion. Someone had maintained it. Someone had intended this door to stay closed. Her fingers tightened around the key. "Not today," she whispered. The words surprised even her. She was not ready. The fall had shaken something loose, not only in the banister, but in her confidence. She needed to steady herself before opening whatever waited beyond. She slid the key carefully into her pocket instead. Atlas's ears twitched. "I know," she said softly. "We'll see." Together, they descended the staircase carefully, and each step felt deliberate now, measured. At the bottom, she paused and looked up toward the hallway. The drip had slowed to silence. The house felt different, not hostile, not welcoming, aware. Evelyn placed the wax paper and the key on the kitchen table and sat heavily in the chair beside it. Her ribs throbbed, but the pain grounded her. 8 years ago. Harold Finch had hidden a key behind the banister of a house no one cared about. And Atlas had led her straight to it. She ran her thumb over the smooth brass edge once more. Winter pressed harder against the windows. But for the first time since arriving, fear gave way to something else. Suspicion. Not of the house, but of the story she had been told about it. Worthless. She looked toward the staircase again. The key lay between her fingers. And upstairs, chained behind a locked door, something waited that had been meant to remain hidden. Not forever, just long enough. Evelyn did not sleep much that night. The brass key rested on the nightstand beside her, catching stray firelight from the dying embers in the hearth downstairs. Each time the wind brushed against the house, her gaze shifted to it. Atlas remained at the base of the stairs, though his vigilance had softened. He did not pace, he did not bark, he simply waited. Morning came quiet and pale. The frost had retreated slightly, leaving the hills washed in muted gray. The house felt still, almost expectant. Evelyn rose carefully, her ribs stiff but manageable. She dressed slowly, layered sweater over sweater, then picked up the key. "All right," she said softly. "Let's see." Atlas stood immediately. They climbed the stairs together, each step deliberate. The hallway no longer felt threatening, just narrow, focused. The locked door waited at the end, unchanged, patient. Evelyn knelt before it and studied the lock again. The brass had dulled, but the mechanism appeared intact. She slid the key into place. It fit. For a moment she did nothing. The house held its breath. Atlas leaned forward slightly, not touching the door, just close enough to feel its presence. Evelyn turned the key. A soft click answered. Not dramatic, not echoing, just certain. She wrapped her hand around the knob and turned it slowly. The hinges resisted at first, then gave with a muted groan as the door opened inward. The air inside felt cooler than the hallway, but not stale, not abandoned. Light from the frosted window behind her spilled into the room, illuminating shapes in muted relief. Filing cabinets. 3 of them, tall and metal, arranged neatly along one wall. A long wooden table stood near the center of the room, covered in stacked folders bound with twine. Rolled architectural drawings rested in a wire basket near the corner. On another wall, framed photographs hung in precise alignment. Their glass dusty but intact. It was not a storage room. It was an archive. Evelyn stepped inside slowly, Atlas following just behind her heel. The floorboards did not sag beneath her weight. The walls bore faint pencil markings, measurements, dates, notes in tidy handwriting. She approached the nearest filing cabinet and pulled the top drawer open. Inside, rows of labeled folders stood upright. 1931. Borders, 1932. Widow registrations, 1933. Financial ledgers. Her breath caught. She opened a folder carefully. Typed forms. Handwritten signatures. Names she did not recognize. Addresses of coal camps long gone. On the wall behind her, one photograph drew her eye. A group of women standing shoulder to shoulder on this very porch decades earlier. Their dresses plain, their expressions steady, children clustered around them. A faded sign behind them read, Finch Boarding House, Harold. She moved to the wooden table and untied one of the bound stacks. Letters, dozens of them, each addressed to Mr. Finch or boarding house steward. She read the first few lines of one at random. Thank you for keeping the doors open when no one else would. Her fingers trembled slightly. This house had not simply been a residence. It had been refuge. Atlas moved farther into the room now, sniffing the air lightly before settling near the table. His posture relaxed fully for the first time since arriving at the property. He lowered himself onto the floor and exhaled. Evelyn noticed it immediately. The tension that had anchored him to the hallway dissolved. His ears softened. His gaze no longer fixed on the door. You were guarding this, she murmured. She crossed to the far corner where a narrow bookshelf held several thick binders. Each bore handwritten labels in careful script. Historical Survey, Clay County Mining Settlements, Structural Integrity Report, Preliminary Grant Application Draft, W.V. Preservation Trust. Her heartbeat quickened. She opened the structural report. Detailed notes filled each page. Measurements, load-bearing assessments, sketches of foundation reinforcements. Someone had evaluated this house not as debris, but as potential. She turned to the grant application draft. Unfinished. Sections highlighted. Supporting documents clipped carefully to the back. Letters of intent from local historical societies. Harold Finch had not hidden junk. He had hidden work. Work no one else valued. Evelyn sank slowly into the wooden chair beside the table. Worthless. The word felt hollow now. Atlas lifted his head briefly, then rested it on his paws again, content. She scanned the final page of the draft. Funding requested for restoration and historical landmark designation, pending verification of structural benchmarks. She stood and walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, studying the ceiling beams, the floor supports. No visible rot, no severe warping. The damage downstairs did not extend here. The leak in the hallway likely stemmed from roof flashing, not collapse. The room itself had been preserved deliberately. The lock, the hidden key behind the banister, the wax paper protecting it from moisture. 8 years ago. Harold had known something. He had not finished. She approached the doorway and turned back once more. This was not a treasure room. There was no gold, no secret fortune. There was documentation, evidence, history, and purpose. Atlas rose slowly and walked toward her, brushing lightly against her leg before stepping out into the hallway. She left the door open. For the first time, the hallway did not feel narrow. It felt connected. They descended together, and when they reached the bottom, Evelyn paused. The house seemed quieter, and not because the wind had stopped, but because the unknown had been replaced with understanding. She carried one folder downstairs and placed it gently on the kitchen table beside the brass key. Sunlight filtered faintly through the window, catching dust motes in the air. "Not worthless," she whispered. Atlas lay near the fireplace, fully relaxed now. The house did not feel hostile. It felt unfinished. And upstairs, the locked room no longer held mystery. It held intention. The discovery did not bring celebration. It brought responsibility. Evelyn spent the next 2 days seated at the kitchen table, reading through folders Harold had labeled in careful, steady handwriting. Atlas lay at her feet or followed her upstairs when she returned documents to their precise drawers. The room remained open now, with sunlight filtering through the narrow window at the end of the hall. Harold Finch had documented everything. Boarding records from the 1930s, photographs of coal miners' widows standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch, structural sketches marked with red ink, notes about reinforcement beams and drainage correction. He had measured this house, studied it, believed in it. On the third morning, Evelyn dialed the number listed on one of the grant proposal drafts. West Virginia Preservation Trust. The call rang 5 times before a calm, professional voice answered. "Naomi Patel speaking. My name is Evelyn Mercer," she said carefully. "I've recently inherited a property in Clay County. It appears your organization may have been working with the previous owner." There was a pause, papers shuffling. "Harold Finch?" Naomi asked. "Oh, yes." Another pause, longer this time. "We had preliminary discussions with Mr. Finch. He was compiling documentation for a landmark application. We never received the finalized submission." "It's here," Evelyn said, "in my dining room." Silence on the other end, then a slight shift in tone. "You're certain?" "I'm looking at it." Naomi exhaled slowly. "That house has historical potential, Mrs. Mercer. But potential doesn't guarantee funding. It would require a formal structural inspection, community backing, and completion of the application." "I understand. May I ask, are you planning to sell?" The question lingered in the air. "I'm planning to stay," Evelyn replied. After the call ended, she sat still for a long moment. Atlas rested his head lightly against her knee. The house no longer felt like an accident. It felt like a ledger left open. By late afternoon, the gravel crunch of tires announced a visitor. Mark stepped out of a silver SUV, adjusting his coat as he surveyed the property with narrowed eyes. He hadn't called ahead. Evelyn met him at the porch. "This is it?" he asked. "This is it." He climbed the steps cautiously, testing the railing with a quick shake. "You didn't mention how remote it was." "You didn't ask." Inside, he moved slowly through the living room, glancing at ceiling cracks and window seams. His expression was not cruel, just practical. "Mom," he began, lowering his voice, "this place is a liability. It's a house. It's an old structure in a declining county. I looked it up." She folded her hands calmly. "Did you?" "There are developers buying land out here. Cash offers. Now you could walk away from this and move somewhere comfortable." Atlas stood between them, not aggressive, but steady. "I've contacted the Preservation Trust," Evelyn said. Mark blinked. "For what?" "For what the house actually is." "And what is that?" "A former boarding home for miners' widows." Mark exhaled sharply. "That doesn't change the fact that you're 80 and living in a drafty building with failing infrastructure." The words landed harder than he intended. She saw concern beneath them, but also assumption. "You think I can't manage it," she said quietly. "I think you deserve stability." So did the women who lived here. He hesitated. You don't owe anyone anything, he said. She looked toward the staircase. This house isn't about owing, she replied. It's about finishing. Mark walked toward the window and looked out over the hills. Finishing what? She did not answer immediately. Atlas shifted his weight, glancing upstairs briefly before returning his gaze to Mark. There's documentation, she said finally. Grant drafts, structural plans. Harold wasn't hiding junk. He was protecting something unfinished. Mark rubbed his forehead. Mom, that's not your responsibility. The tension between them did not explode. It thickened. Outside, wind moved through the trees, softer now than it had been days before. Let me make some calls, Mark continued. Just explore options. You may explore them, she said. I'm not promising to accept them. He studied her face. For the first time since she arrived in West Virginia, she felt anchored, not by defiance, but by clarity, and Mark stayed only an hour. When he left, Atlas watched the SUV disappear down the gravel drive before turning and heading upstairs. Evelyn followed. The locked room no longer required guarding, yet Atlas entered it first and circled once before settling near the table. Evelyn opened Harold's unfinished grant application again. Incomplete, but not impossible. The house they called worthless had not been abandoned by neglect. It had been paused, and now paused no longer. 3 days after her call with Naomi Patel, a white sedan climbed the gravel drive and stopped near the sagging porch. Evelyn had been expecting it. She stood at the front window as the engine cut off, Atlas seated beside her, alert but calm. A woman stepped out first, mid-40s, dark hair pulled into a low bun, clipboard tucked under her arm. Naomi. But behind her followed a man in a heavy canvas jacket, carrying a metal case. He paused to examine the roofline before walking toward the steps. Evelyn opened the door before they knocked. Mrs. Mercer? Naomi's voice was warm but measured. Yes, thank you for coming. Naomi stepped onto the porch and glanced across the valley. It's exactly as Harold described. That's reassuring, Evelyn replied. The man introduced himself as Grant Holloway, structural inspector contracted through the Preservation Trust. His handshake was firm but polite. We'll need to assess load-bearing walls, foundation integrity, roof framing, he explained. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be viable. Viable. Evelyn nodded. Atlas stepped forward slightly, and positioning himself between Evelyn and the inspector's case until she placed a gentle hand on his collar. It's all right, she murmured. Grant moved through the house methodically, tapping beams, testing floorboards, measuring cracks. Naomi followed with notes in careful shorthand. Evelyn stayed close but silent, watching their expressions more than their tools. When they reached the staircase, Grant paused. This section here, he said, pointing to the water stain along the ceiling beneath the hallway. Recent leak? Yes. He climbed carefully, testing each step. Atlas followed halfway up, then stopped, turning his head briefly toward the locked room, now open. Naomi entered the archive space first. She did not speak immediately. She walked slowly along the filing cabinets, fingertips grazing the metal. She lifted a folder, flipped through its contents, then looked toward Evelyn. You weren't exaggerating, she said quietly. Grant stepped inside next and scanned the ceiling beams. These are original timbers, he murmured. Old-growth oak. They don't make them like this anymore. He crouched near the baseboard and pressed a small device against the wood. The reading beeped softly. No significant rot, he said. Some surface moisture from roof flashing, but structural integrity is intact. Evelyn felt something inside her loosen. Naomi moved toward the long table and examined the unfinished grant draft. Harold was thorough, she said. He just didn't finish. Evelyn looked at the window at the end of the hallway, where winter light filtered through thin glass. He hid the key behind the banister. Naomi glanced up sharply. Oh, he never mentioned that. He must have planned for someone to find it. Grant completed his circuit of the room and stepped back into the hallway. Here's the truth, he said, closing his case. The house needs reinforcement in the southern roof span and updated drainage along the foundation. It's not cheap, but it's not collapsing. Naomi turned to Evelyn. If we can demonstrate community support and finalize the application, we can petition for conditional landmark status. That would unlock phased funding. Evelyn absorbed the words slowly. Conditional. Funding. Not a promise, but not dismissal either. Downstairs, wind brushed gently against the porch railing. The house no longer felt like it was defending itself. It felt evaluated. As they exited, Atlas remained upstairs briefly before descending last, as though ensuring nothing was left unsettled. Outside, Naomi lingered near her car. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "There will be pushback. Developers prefer clean slates, but the documentation you have, it's compelling." Evelyn nodded. "I'm not afraid of paperwork," she said. Naomi smiled faintly. "Good." After they left, silence returned, but it felt different now. Not heavy, measured. That evening, as dusk settled over the hills, another truck rolled up the drive. Silas Boone stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Heard you had company," he called. Evelyn met him at the porch. "Inspection," she said. "And?" "Viable." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. Meaning it's not falling apart." He studied the roofline again, then the porch beams. "My grandmother boarded here," he said quietly, "after my grandfather died in the mines." Evelyn turned toward him. "She mentioned Mr. Finch once, said he kept the doors open when nobody else would." The wind moved through the valley below, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from distant houses. Silas cleared his throat. "If you need hands to fix that southern span, I've got tools." Atlas stepped onto the porch beside Evelyn, calm, observant. She glanced toward the hills, then back at the house. "Thank you," she said simply. That night, she returned to the archive room and sat alone at the long wooden table. She ran her fingers across the margins of Harold's unfinished draft, reading his careful annotations. Atlas lay near the doorway, not guarding now, just present. The house had been inspected, measured, judged, and it had not failed. Home for the first time since crossing the state line, Evelyn allowed herself a small, quiet breath of hope. Not certainty, not victory, but possibility. Possibility, however, had a price. The call came the following afternoon. Evelyn had just finished labeling a stack of copied documents for Naomi when her phone vibrated against the kitchen table. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. "This is Evelyn Mercer." "Mrs. Mercer, this is Thomas Kellerman with Appalachian Ridge Development. I believe you recently inherited property on Laurel Creek Road." Her grip tightened slightly on the phone. "Yes. We've been acquiring parcels in that corridor for a residential expansion project. I understand your house has structural challenges." The pause felt calculated. "It's under review," she said evenly. I'm sure," Kellerman replied smoothly. "We'd like to make you a firm offer for the land and structure as is. No contingencies. Immediate closing." He named the number. It was higher than she expected. Higher than what her Pittsburgh apartment had been worth. Enough for assisted living without worry. Enough for comfort. Enough to silence every argument about practicality. She stared at the window as he spoke, watching clouds move slowly over the ridge. "I'll consider it," she said. "Of course. I'll send the written offer by email. We're prepared to move quickly." When the call ended, the house felt unusually quiet. Atlas lifted his head from the hearthrug. She sat down slowly. The figure lingered in her thoughts, not as temptation, but as weight. An hour later, Mark called. I heard from someone in the county records office," he began without greeting. "You're being approached by a developer." That was fast. "They're reputable. This is what I've been telling you. You can secure your future and be done with this." "Done with what?" "With risk." She rose from the table and began walking slowly toward the staircase. "With history?" she asked. "Mom, you're not a museum curator." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." She ended the call gently before the conversation hardened. Upstairs, the archive room waited with its open drawers and patient stacks. Atlas followed closely. She stepped inside and closed the door halfway behind her, not to lock it, but to contain the quiet. The afternoon light angled across the long wooden table, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily through the air. She selected one of the older letters at random. The paper had yellowed, but remained sturdy. Dear Mr. Finch, we have nowhere else to go. The company says the housing is reserved for families with working men. She read slowly, tracing each line. Another letter spoke of children sharing narrow beds, of meals stretched thin, of gratitude for warmth and walls. The house had not been built as an investment. It had been built as shelter. Atlas moved beside her chair and rested his head gently against her thigh. She placed her hand on his fur without looking down. They want to buy it, she murmured. He exhaled softly. The sun shifted lower outside the window. The hills beyond the glass glowed faintly amber. She rose and walked to the far wall where Harold's structural notes were pinned neatly beneath thumbtacks. Reinforcement required on southern span. Drainage correction essential before spring thaw. The work was not imaginary. It would demand time, energy, coordination. She looked at her hands. They were steady, but older. Later that evening, Silas stopped by again, this time carrying a toolbox. Thought I'd check that roof seam before the next storm, he said. She nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. While he climbed into the attic space above the southern span, she remained below, listening to the measured thuds of his boots and the scrape of tools. Needs patching, not replacing, he called down. I can brace it temporarily. Temporary, she echoed. That's how most good things start, he replied. After he left, she returned upstairs. Atlas followed as always. This time he did not position himself near the door, but he lay beside the table as she gathered several letters into a neat stack. The developer's number lingered in her mind. Immediate closing, comfort, relief. She imagined packing the folders into boxes and handing them over to someone who saw only acreage. She imagined the locked room emptied. The thought unsettled her more than winter wind ever had. She carried one framed photograph downstairs and set it on the mantel beside the fireplace. The women on the porch stared outward from another era. Worthless, she said softly. The word no longer fit. Night settled early again. The house hummed faintly with the low burn of the fire. Atlas rested at her feet, content. Evelyn sat in the armchair, the written offer email open on her phone screen. She read it once, then again, and then she powered the phone off and set it face down on the table. Upstairs, the archive room door remained open, no longer guarded, but never forgotten. The offer waited. So did the house. And for the first time since her eviction notice arrived in red ink, Evelyn realized the choice before her was not about survival. It was about alignment. She closed her eyes briefly and listened to the wind brush gently against the eaves. The house did not tremble. It stood. The town hall sat between a hardware store and a shuttered diner, its brick facade faded but intact. A small American flag moved gently in the late afternoon breeze. Evelyn parked along the curb, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel. Atlas occupied the passenger seat, watching pedestrians drift toward the entrance. You don't have to come in, she told him softly. He blinked at her, unpersuaded. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows, facing a long wooden table where 3 council members sat beneath fluorescent lights. A coffee urn steamed quietly in the corner. The room smelled faintly of dust and burnt grounds. Naomi Patel stood near the front, reviewing notes clipped to her board. When she saw Evelyn enter, her expression steadied. You made it, Naomi said. I said I would. Silas stood near the back wall, arms folded loosely. A few older residents murmured to one another in low tones. Mark sat in the final row, his presence quieter than usual, his posture reserved. Atlas lay down beside Evelyn's chair without instruction. The council chairperson, a gray-haired woman named Martha Lane, tapped a small gavel against the table. We're here to discuss the provisional landmark petition for the Finch boarding house property on Laurel Creek Road, she began. Her tone was formal, but not dismissive. Naomi spoke first, outlining the documentation Harold had compiled. She referenced structural viability confirmed by inspection. She spoke of potential heritage tourism grants, of educational value, of preservation as community continuity. Then she turned slightly toward Evelyn. Mrs. Mercer would like to share a few words. Evelyn rose slowly. For a brief second, her hands felt colder than they had in the winter hallway upstairs. The room blurred slightly around the edges. She had balanced ledgers for decades. She had negotiated contracts. But this was different. This was personal. She unfolded a single sheet of paper from her coat pocket. I inherited this house unexpectedly, she began. Her voice was steady, but quiet. I was told it was structurally worthless. A few chairs shifted. I've since learned it was once a boarding home for minors' widows, women whose husbands never came home. The room grew still. She looked down at the page and read from one of the letters. We arrived with nothing but 2 trunks and 3 children. Mr. Finch said the doors would stay open. Her voice strengthened. This house kept doors open when others were closed. She glanced toward Mark briefly before continuing. It needs repair. It needs work. But it is not empty. It holds record of lives that built this county. Silas shifted forward, nodding once. Evelyn folded the paper and placed it back in her pocket. I'm not asking for charity, she said. I'm asking for recognition that what stands on that hill is part of this town's story. She sat down slowly. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was evaluative. A councilman leaned toward his microphone. Funding is conditional. The structure must meet safety standards before public designation. Naomi nodded. The initial inspection confirms viability. Reinforcement and drainage corrections are achievable. A woman in the second row stood. My grandmother boarded there, she said softly. She told us about it. I thought it was just stories. Another man spoke up from the side wall. Developers will level it if we don't act. Mark's gaze remained fixed forward. Martha Lane tapped her gavel again. We will vote on provisional historic status, pending structural remediation and documented community support. The vote was not dramatic. No raised voices, no spectacle. One by one, hands lifted, 3 in favor, none opposed. Evelyn did not move at first. The decision settled over her slowly, like the first thaw after frost. Silas exhaled audibly. Naomi leaned closer. This doesn't guarantee funding, she whispered. But it opens the door. Evelyn nodded. Mark stood quietly as the chairs began to scrape against the floor. He approached her without accusation this time. You sounded like yourself, he said. She studied his expression. And what does that mean? Certain. Atlas rose, stretching once before positioning himself at her side. Mark looked at the dog, then back at his mother. I didn't realize how much this mattered to you. I didn't either, she replied. Outside, dusk had begun to settle over the town. The hardware store lights flickered on. The flag moved gently against the fading sky. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Silas approached. You'll have help on that roof, he said. Word spreads fast. Evelyn looked down the street at the modest storefronts, at the faded paint and aging brick that still held. The house on Laurel Creek Road was no longer isolated. It had a vote behind it. Atlas walked beside her, no longer alert, no longer guarding. Steady. Mark lingered for a moment before heading to his car. I'll stay the weekend, he said quietly. See what needs doing. Evelyn nodded once. The night air felt different than it had weeks before. Colder, perhaps, but clearer. Well, the house had been called worthless. Now it had been named. And naming something changes how it stands. The snow came early that year. It arrived in long, steady sheets that softened the hills and erased the sharp edges of the road leading to Laurel Creek. The porch sagged under the weight of it, but held. The roofline bowed slightly beneath the accumulation, braced now by the temporary reinforcement Silas and Mark had installed along the southern span. Mark had stayed longer than he planned. He rose early each morning, climbed into the attic space with Silas, and returned dusted in insulation and sawdust. They spoke little while working, but the rhythm between them settled into something unforced. Evelyn watched from below, handing up tools when needed, her movements slower but certain. Atlas remained nearby, was no longer stationed at the archive room door, but drifting between floors as if overseeing progress. The provisional historic plaque arrived by mail in mid-December, a simple metal sign bearing the words Finch Boarding House, established 1930s, pending landmark status. Silas mounted it beside the front door. It was modest, not ornate, but it altered the posture of the porch. Snow piled high against the foundation. The drainage trench dug along the southern edge diverted melting runoff just enough to prevent pooling. Grant Holloway returned briefly to recheck the reinforcements and signed off on the temporary structural compliance required for grant review. Naomi's email came 2 days before Christmas. Conditional funding approved. Phase 1 restoration authorized. Evelyn read it twice before handing the phone to Mark. He smiled faintly. "Oh, well," he said, "you weren't chasing ghosts." "No," she replied softly, "just paperwork." Claire arrived unexpectedly on New Year's weekend. She stepped inside cautiously, brushing snow from her boots. Her gaze moved slowly across the living room, past the fireplace, the mantel photograph, the stacks of neatly organized folders awaiting cataloging. "I didn't think it would look like this," she admitted. "Like what?" Evelyn asked. "Like it belongs to you." Evelyn considered that. Claire wandered upstairs alone and stood in the archive room doorway for a long time. When she returned, her eyes were thoughtful. "I should have asked more questions," she said quietly. Evelyn did not press her. She simply nodded. Winter pressed hard through January. The furnace faltered once but recovered after Mark replaced a failing component. Silas coordinated a small group of volunteers, retired carpenters, a former electrician, 2 high school students needing service hours. They stabilized window frames, cleared snow from the porch roof, reinforced the stair tread Evelyn had slipped on weeks earlier. The house did not feel fragile now. It felt supported. Atlas adjusted to the new rhythm without protest. He no longer slept upstairs exclusively. Sometimes he lay near the hearth. Other nights he chose the hallway outside the archive room, not guarding, just resting. One afternoon, as sunlight finally broke through weeks of gray, Evelyn stood at the upstairs window overlooking the valley. The snow had begun to recede in uneven patches, revealing brown grass beneath. Mark approached quietly behind her. "You could have taken the offer," he said. "Oh, yes." "You'd be warm in a managed facility right now." "I am warm," she replied. He looked around the archive room, the filing cabinets, the framed photographs, the neatly labeled binders. "I didn't understand," he admitted. "I thought you were clinging to something out of stubbornness." Evelyn turned toward him. "I was clinging to something unfinished." He nodded slowly. Downstairs, Claire's laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen as she spoke with Silas about a local fundraiser idea for additional restoration phases. Atlas trotted into the room and leaned gently against Evelyn's leg. The house, once called worthless, now carried movement, footsteps, voices, plans. February arrived with one final storm. Heavy, wet snow bent the tree branches low. The reinforced southern span groaned under the weight, but did not give. Volunteers arrived with shovels before dawn, clearing pathways and brushing accumulation from the roofline. Evelyn stood at the porch, wrapped in a wool coat, watching neighbors move with quiet determination. The house held. By March, the thaw came in earnest. Snowmelt ran cleanly through the drainage channel. The hills softened to green. The gravel drive reappeared beneath retreating ice. Grant returned once more and signed the updated compliance report. Naomi's final confirmation followed soon after. Phase 2, restoration, approved. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood beneath her hands. Atlas lay stretched across the floorboards, older now, slower in rising, but content. Claire visited again, bringing framed copies of several archive photographs she had professionally restored. Mark stood on the porch with Silas discussing the installation of a small informational plaque near the driveway. The house that had once seemed abandoned now carried layered purpose. Evelyn walked upstairs to the archive room and paused at the doorway. The filing cabinets remained where Harold had left them. The letters were preserved. The grant application, once unfinished, now bore completed signatures and official seals. Atlas followed her in and settled beside the window. For the first time since she had arrived in West Virginia, there was no sense of waiting. Winter had tested the beams. Community had steadied them. The house had endured. And so had she. 2 years later, the gravel drive no longer looked forgotten. It curved gently past a small wooden sign that read, Finch Boarding House, Heritage Residence and Archive. So beneath it, in smaller letters, established 1930s, restored with community support. Spring sunlight warmed the hills, and the valley below shimmered in soft green layers. The porch rail, once sagging, stood straight and newly sealed. Window frames were painted a muted cream that matched the original color discovered beneath decades of wear. Inside, the house carried a different sound now. Footsteps, soft voices, the rustle of pages turning. The archive room, once locked, once guarded, had been transformed carefully, not altered beyond recognition. The filing cabinets remained, polished but original. The long wooden table held neatly arranged research binders for visiting families tracing mining history. Framed photographs lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names recovered from Harold's meticulous documentation. The door no longer closed. It remained open throughout visiting hours. Evelyn lived in a modest upstairs apartment created from what had once been a storage room beside the archive. The renovation had preserved the beams and window placement. Her small kitchen overlooked the hillside, and her armchair sat near the same narrow hallway where Atlas had once refused to move. Atlas. He moved slower now. His muzzle had gone almost entirely white. His hips stiffened in the mornings, but his eyes remained clear and steady. He spent most afternoons beside the archive room window, sunlight warming his back as guests quietly moved through the space. Sometimes children would kneel beside him, their hands gentle against his fur. He tolerated the attention with dignified patience. On a bright Saturday in May, Evelyn stood at the base of the staircase as a small group gathered for the house's official reopening ceremony. Naomi Patel stood near the front door, smiling as she greeted guests. Silas leaned against the porch rail outside, overseeing final touches to the landscaping. Claire arranged refreshments on the long dining table. Mark adjusted the informational plaque near the driveway one last time. The Regional Development Corporation had made another offer 6 months earlier, larger than the first. Polite, professional, persistent. Evelyn had declined without hesitation. Now, as she climbed the stairs to the archive room, she paused halfway, at the very spot where she had once slipped. The banister rail had been secured permanently. The cavity where the wax-wrapped key had been hidden was sealed and reinforced. Just a small framed note hung discreetly nearby. Original key discovered behind banister, 2023. She touched the wood lightly before continuing. Inside the archive room, sunlight poured across the table. Visitors stood reading letters that had once gathered dust. A young couple traced a finger across a photograph of their great-grandmother, standing on this porch 90 years earlier. "This was her," the woman whispered. Evelyn approached quietly. "Harold kept everything," she said gently. The couple turned, gratitude visible in their faces. "Thank you for saving this place," the man said. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "It was already here," she replied. "It just needed finishing." Atlas shifted beside the window and lifted his head as if to confirm the statement. Later that afternoon, when the visitors had left and the porch grew quiet again, Evelyn returned to the archive room alone. She walked slowly to the long table and rested her hands on its surface. The room no longer felt like a discovery. It felt lived in. Outside the open door, the hallway stretched toward the staircase, not narrow, not foreboding, simply part of the house's path. Atlas rose with effort and padded toward her, settling at her feet. "You were right," she murmured to him. He exhaled softly. She moved to the window and looked out across the hills. 2 years earlier, she had arrived with an eviction notice folded in her purse and a lawyer's blunt description echoing in her mind. Structurally worthless. If she had accepted the first offer, the house would likely have been leveled within months, the letters dispersed. The records boxed into obscurity or discarded entirely. Instead, children now walked through its rooms learning about coal camps and resilience. Descendants discovered names preserved in careful ink. The porch once again held gatherings, not of widows seeking shelter, but of neighbors honoring memory. Atlas lay down slowly near the threshold, content.
Evelyn looked around the room one last time before descending the stair for the evening. She did not close the archived door behind her. She never did. Being evicted had forced her through the door she had not chosen. The locked room upstairs had not hidden well on Fontaine. It had rotated timely, and the dog, who would not leave that door, has simply refused to let it pop up be forgotten. Sometimes, what the words calling Wallace is seemingly unfinished. And sometimes, the door that refused to close behind you is the one that leads to the work you will mean to rotate on alone. Some houses are built from timber and store, and some are built from memory, waiting for someone willing to listen. Evelyn didn't find treasure behind that dock door. She found a reason to stay when leaving would have been easier. If you were in her place, would you have taken the offer or opened the door? Say your choice in the comments. And if sorry like this remind you that it's never too late to begin again, we'll be honest to help, right, and honest for the next one.